everybody. Really grateful that you have taken some time out to be with us this evening. This is one of our weekly Parents for Future community calls, and we're focusing this evening on collapse preparing communities. It was really great to hear everybody introduce themselves just now and hear the different kind of relationships and experiences with the word collapse and how it's being used in your communities. I'm Lucie, I use she, her pronouns. I'm one of the co-directors, one of the part-time co-directors at Parents for Future. And I'm also a volunteer co-coordinator in our local Parents for Future group in Stroud. And I'm really pleased to be sharing this call this evening with my friend and comrade Jo, who I first met in 2019 when we were living in opposite sides of London. And we met mostly remotely because we were both in different ways involved in establishing Extinction Rebellion families at that time. And then fortuitously and coincidentally, both moved to Stroud at the same time. And when was that? Right at the end of 2019. And I ended up with children in the same kindergarten, and of course, a beautiful friendship developed and a desire to get back involved in community organising in Stroud. And like I think Barbara mentioned in Top Nest, there's a lot in Stroud of different community groups and different things happening. So it takes a little while to figure out where you can sort of best add value. But we set up our local Parents for Future group about 3 years ago, which is sort of part of the story of how this project was born. But I'm going to pass over to Jo now to introduce herself properly.
Okay. I've just had that deadly, your internet connection is unstable message. I was about to just flick on the booster in case it helps. Hang on.
It always comes just in time, doesn't it?
Let's see. The valleys and the fibre optics sometimes don't work that well.
It's all okay our end, just so you know, you're nice and clear.
Yeah, so just wanting to echo Lucie's appreciation that you've all turned up tonight and have already shared and want to hear more and share together and learn together. And I guess, yeah, I was also, as I think Barbara said, it was really touching to hear people's experiences and something about honouring how hard it is when we feel on our own with this scientific and lived reality that we're in globally of collapse, and it's still business as usual, life as usual, consuming as usual for the majority of people around us, and it can be really isolating. And then at times it's really helpful respite, isn't it, because it's hard to stay in that place, and sometimes it's just quite nice to come out and have a bit of just sort of go back into something which feels a bit more familiar to what we had for most of our lifetimes. And maybe we'll touch on some more of the themes that you brought up around connecting groups working together and kind of information flows and also the language of resilience, which I agree has something really useful in it, particularly if we are understanding it as not bouncing back to something because we know that A, we don't want to go back because these systems are toxic, and B, we can't because they are in their end stage. But it's staying able to function even when things are changing rapidly or dramatically. So yes. So this is a story that we'll be able to kind of share this evening, and it's a journey in which we knew that Lucie and I kind of would often repeat to each other in those early days when it felt a bit of a thing to kind of step out and want to start talking about collapse, that the journey is as important as the destination, and recognizing also that we're all on a journey, you're all on a journey. Some of you have been in this work for decades, as people have already shared. I'm really relatively much newer. So I've got a lot to learn from people that have been on this path for longer, and we're in a conundrum of as we know, we're in uncertain times, and we're trying to figure out as best we can how to navigate that. And there's no blueprint or manual, and we've got to piece it together ourselves. So as Lucie mentioned, we met in the sort of NVDA, nonviolent direct action world on the streets in London, supporting parents to be there with little ones, which was amazingly energizing and felt very powerful. And I also recognized that it wasn't going to be where I would put my energy for the longer term, and I wanted to move to somewhere to grow up more connected to nature, to heal that piece of the picture of the disconnection, and also to support community resilience. And somewhere like Stroud felt like it would be so awake to this. It clearly was already ahead of the game in many ways in terms of conservation and biodiversity, and building a kind of sense of compassionate community. And yet, of course, it's like every other place where there are plenty of people who, are in a completely different space. And that was the thinking that kind of began to get us thinking a bit more about a different way of approaching it. So getting involved with a climate action group, which was part of the Transition Stroud Forum. And this was 5 or so years ago. And feeling really keenly still that gap between where we are and where we need to be, and the lack of leadership and the lack of a plan, just this feeling of this lack of a plan, and being in a climate action network space in my local parish and feeling censored about talking about this bigger picture of collapse, being reminded that this is off-putting and that we need to go where people's energy is in terms of climate action work. And it didn't speak to me. I felt like there has to be another way. We need to be able to start finding our way into talking about this bigger picture strategic work that's needed, because if the government isn't going to make decisions quickly enough and boldly enough, then we are just going to be living with the consequences. And how are we going to do that? And citizens' assemblies were really in the field. It was Exile's Third Demand. There were other spaces where they were being debated. They were really tried and tested and trusted if they're done well, which is an important caveat. And maybe in a way they're a bit of a Trojan horse for being able to start talking about collapse, because it's very acceptable and actually very invigorating, and rightly so. Democracy is yet another broken system. And so it's really, it felt very potent to begin to start talking about collapse. So as Lucie mentioned, she and I had kind of had a bit of a moment where we were like, Lucie had taken on a role with PFF, and she was keen to experience what it would be like having a local group. And I agreed to support with that, and then brought this idea, and Lucie was like, yeah, absolutely, let's give this a try. So it was a bit of a Thelma and Louise moment at times of thinking, we'll try and bring this into the landscape and the spaces in Stroud. So Lucie, over to you.
Thank you, Jo. So the journey, the next stage of the journey, I guess, began within our local Parents for Future group. Jo suggested that this is something we could explore, that perhaps looking a little bit deeper at how we can respond in our communities to the crises that we're facing would be a sensible next move for our group. And we took it to the group, and I remember sitting around the group who were and remain really committed to resisting fossil fuels and to protecting nature and to doing all the things that we do at Parents for Future. But there was also this kind of sigh of relief around the room at the suggestion that we could start building, like sort of starting to weave and explore, preparing the soil for a participatory ecosystem. So I'm just letting people into the room. So I think a real relief that actually this is something that we could talk about and that we could work a little bit more deeply at a local level, understanding what's already being done, understanding what the existing knowledge and skills are in the community. And at this time we were thinking, maybe it would be as simple as planning an assembly that could happen in a year or two. So we had the consent of our group to move forward with this. And as Jo sort of referenced, it felt pretty daunting. We didn't have experience of running assemblies. We didn't know where the expertise was in Stroud. We knew it was really important to get sort of buy-in and to represent and hear from a diversity of perspectives. So we initially called the project Pathways to Participation, because as Jo said, we acknowledged that the journey of learning about this together as a community was valuable in itself as much as where we ended up. So it felt like a piece of political education and a way for our group to step into something new and to learn together. So we opened conceptually and practically within Stroud this Pathways to Participation, hoping that others would step in. And we're very fortuitous in Stroud to have a lot of local expertise, which once we'd kind of created this space to learn together, we did have people step in. We were introduced by someone in our Parents for Future group to Rich and Claire Wilson, who are some of the sort of globe's leading experts on citizens' assemblies. And Joe had met with Ros Savage, who was a Liberal Democrat candidate, now MP, and Adrian Oldman, who is a Green councillor. And together we formed like a small team to try and figure out like what the next step would be. And from that, we decided that one of the first ways to start to reach a wider audience in Stroud and sense check the ideas and learn more was to engage with existing community organisers and sort of Stroud civic society. So we formed what we called a collapse-aware leadership group. So Joe and I at this point were quite comfortable with the word collapse. I'd just completed a sort of comms and leadership in collapse intense course with Jem Bendel and others. And I'd been through a grieving process and an acceptance and an awareness of the opportunity of speaking about collapse. And Joe had done an awful lot of her own work in this space. So we pulled together this group, which consisted of councillors, local politicians, people who run the food hubs, community organisers, our young activists, and brought people into a room to start exploring what collapse looks like and how we can respond locally. Really what we decided to do at this point was to prepare the soil. So we continued to learn, we continued to research all the amazing things that are happening globally and nationally in terms of participatory democracy, the different tools that exist beyond an assembly to ensure that we can handle conflict and we can make sure that different voices are heard. And we understood quite quickly that it's happening there's a lot of organic work happening all over the UK, which I'm sure many people here are aware of, but it's happening in very different ways in different places from our exploration, which was very much about coming together and making the learning within the community very much part of the project, to groups like Cooperation Hull, who are really kind of getting on with it with a lot of energy and doing people's assemblies and neighbourhood assemblies quite quickly and sharing those learnings. I think I might pass back to you at this point, Joe.
Yeah, great.
Kind of what came next out of this process.
Yeah. So with our Collapse Aware Leadership Group, we had our first meeting in May 2023, and it was agreed that yes, this seemed like a really sensible way to try and navigate what everybody was aware of in the room is coming, the hard times that are here for some already and that are to come, as Alera mentioned. And it was agreed that we would try and work up some kind of vision of what this would look like. We were really fortunate that Parents for Future had such a good relationship with Warm this winter. We actually managed to apply for some funding and secured some funding, which meant we could pull together a mini design team, which included 2 facilitators who live in Stroud, whose specialism is facilitation for social change and conflict and mediation and how we be together and how we make decisions together is kind of really in their blood and bones. And it felt really another really like good stroke of luck of this kind of all this depth of wisdom and experience that was in Stroud. So the 3 of us began working on a design for the vision of what we wanted this to look like. And we had a really interesting talk by Rich Wilson, that Lucie mentioned, who is a global practitioner of this. And his shorthand for all of this quite technical jargon is self-rule. And I think the title of his presentation was Self-Rule, Why Now is the Time to Do Democracy Ourselves. And we were, let me just do this next slide. We were really learning from him, and we were puzzling this out, that we were aware of people's assemblies and we were aware of citizens' assemblies, but how do you make deep and lasting transformation towards democracy in your community? Maybe not through a series of ad hoc people's assemblies. Maybe it needs to be something a bit more substantial, but maybe a citizens' assembly just on its own is a lot of effort, and then what happens afterwards. And through Rich, we discovered there was such a thing as a standing citizens' assembly that would which would exist permanently, and it would be a form of shadow governance. So that was a kind of an exciting penny drop moment where it's like, this is how it gets really into a community, and then it gets into a whole participatory ecosystem, which I'll come on to. But our vision in a nutshell, and this is how when you kind of go through the detail of what we've written, it feels like, yeah, we are learning or relearning the art of deciding together. And this is about healing and remembering our deeper connections, that we have agency and that our safety depends on all of us. And it feels helpful and potent that we are speaking to this kind of sense of the healing that needs to happen, because our communities are so fractured, and the inequality that exists has created, and the structures around that has created so much challenge and trauma, etc. So it feels really important to speak to these underlying root issues as well in all of this work. This slide has more detail, and these slides will be shared, but essentially, as I've mentioned, it's a standing citizens' assembly. It's redirecting power to the community. It's about listening. I think listening, I'm sure you're all doing this in your own work, aspects of this. It's such an important thing to be doing at this time, particularly given the polarization, how we learn to listen really well, especially when we don't agree with what the other person might be saying. It has to be representative, and actually we like to think about even going beyond representative samples into something which would upweight parts of the population which are particularly impacted by an issue, to make sure their voice is really heard, and to really draw out the depth of the issues that might exist and the opposition that might exist. That we want to bring that in. We want to make sure that is in the room and in the discussion. And we make decisions together, and we want to go beyond decision. We want to go beyond making recommendations about how things could be or should be into actually actioning. So our vision includes an implementation network, which might include mobilizing voluntary energy as well as businesses. And then the whole thing, this is language we've been learning from the experts in our neighborhood, in our area. This is this is a participatory ecosystem, and this might be familiar language to some of you. Essentially, it means that wherever there's a public space, it has the potential to be participatory and to contribute to this sense of growing agency and growing our power, our sense of our power, and actually power literacy, understanding power dynamics and nature of power, toxic power, healthy power, is really inbuilt into our design as well. It's really central that we understand and unlearn where necessary about power. So just as a kind of recap of some of that, we're talking about a standing assembly, not a one-off assembly, because we want it to have that long-lasting power building, and also so that it has the opportunity. We know that it's difficult to turn big institutions around, and they are imploding, and this is about building something so that when there's opportunity, it can step in and pick up some of what's the fallout from the different crises. This is about bottom-up grassroots democracy as opposed to top-down, because we want it to be free from the colonizing institutions and mindsets. We want it to be free to be what it needs to be at this time. And likewise, kind of aligned with that, we're claiming a space for this political work. We're not waiting to be invited in, or we haven't been invited into an existing political space. So we retain that independence, not in an adversarial way or a hostile way, but to retain the independence, but to work with existing structures. And it has to be within this whole ecosystem rather than in a vacuum. Otherwise, it won't get to the depths of what it needs to do in terms of really enabling all of us to step in the ways which suit us, our skills, our capacities. And as I mentioned, we're going beyond recommendations into an implementation network. So that's where we got to with our vision. Life obviously carries on, and other work carries on. Nothing that that nothing else stands still while we're sort of still trying to figure out our piece of the puzzle. And Gail Bradbrook, who'd been supporting this work, was also thinking about what was next for post-XR. And she began thinking at a more national level about collapse preparing communities and what that might look like. And she convened a few calls in the summer last year. And at the same sort of time, she was introduced to the book Lifehouse by Adam Greenfield. And I won't be able to see a show of hands if you're aware of the book or have read it. If you haven't read it and you've got time to do some reading or audible listening or whatever your method of listening is, it's really recommended. And Adam is drawing upon his own experience of Hurricane Sandy in New York when they were left severely disrupted for some weeks after a superstorm. And he's also incredibly steeped in academic research about movements around the world where they've tried to build mutual aid in the face of some kind of either oppression or economic collapse or climate related collapse. And that was quite pivotal when these two things came together, this kind of collapse preparing work and life houses. And it led to this emerging Lifehouse collapse preparing communities network, in which, it's the same spirit as what we've been sharing so far, of this sense of nobody's coming to the rescue. It's down to us. The window, it's never too late, and yet so much has already been lost and will be lost. And we are in this uncertain time of just seeing what can be done to pick up some pieces and build and focus on. We know that modernity needs to be hospiced, and thank you, Vanessa, for all the amazing work that she is doing around that. And we can concentrate on what can be born, what can emerge from the compost. So if you are interested, you can see more in the links that you can see are underlined on the slide. And it was really exciting to try and bring these two together. So as a Collapse Aware leadership group, we'd been continuing to meet on a quarterly basis, and it was a good way of sustaining our intention for a participatory process, because it was a way to keep meeting and sharing where we were with the work. I think we have about 70 people on our mailing list now, and roughly about 20 come to the meetings. And it gives us a good grounding of just checking, getting feedback. Sometimes there can be a feeling of, when are we going to move into action? And I share that, and that's a lot to do with needing some funding. And I'll come more to that. And then actually in the autumn, we brought the idea of becoming a collapse preparing community, and sort of shifting from this Collapse Aware leadership group, which as a name was great for giving us permission to kind of say, look, we want to do this work, and we have to be able to say that this is the context that we're in. But a leadership group wasn't really quite the right descriptor, and actually collapse preparing community feels really good. And in the course of that discussion, there was feeling in the room that crisis would be more palatable than collapse. And I really get that. And I think it's helpful to know that we're in a room where we all are agreed that we are facing the end of the world as we know it, not the end of the world, but the end of the world as we know it, as we have known it. And actually sometimes the language is overwhelming and can lead to like a sense of inner collapse because it's so overwhelming. So really welcoming that there was a preference for crisis. Fortunately, it's still a C, so we can kind of flex it a little bit if necessary. But so we did officially become a Lifehouse crisis preparing community. And what that means is still emerging, but it does speak to, and I think some of you who've joined tonight are in the WhatsApp chat, which I'll mention at the end, but it does speak to some of what Chrissy was talking about in Bristol, about recognising that there's lots of people and lots of groups doing some really helpful things, and if we could link up, and we would become stronger. And this is about being able to provide resources. So having a bit of capacity centrally to say, actually, we can identify, here's a bunch of really useful resources. If you want to get into participatory democracy, if you want to get into the concept of building life houses, where there are spaces for every few hundred houses, or for a parish where there's some sense of we're gathering some resources, we're looking at battery generators and backup power, we're looking at shower facilities, we're looking at all kinds of things, and it's quite well mapped out in Adam's book. And just to reiterate that it's all invitational. So this is not saying this is the way it should be done, but these are like some invitations and some frameworks and some resources which might be useful. So one of the key strands of the collapse preparing communities work, which we're now straddling the kind of Stroud hat with the network hat, is called a neighbourhood design. And this is where the vision that I've laid out in the previous slides comes together. So the neighbourhood design is really thinking about how do we build power at the micro level. And in this work, Gail is drawing on, who has kind of kick-started some thinking, which we've now taken on and begun to develop. She was drawing on her experiences of seeing mobilisation, seeing how people were mobilising in JSO, knowing that for all the challenges and wonders of working with big personalities like Roger, there's some excellent thinking about micro designs and mobilizing people at the door level. So all of this thinking, this kind of bigger picture, and mobilizing, and the depth of the problems that we're in has kind of come together in some of this thinking. And actually, on a later slide, I've referenced some of the work by Daniel Schmachtenberger, which you may or may not have come across, but he is talking about a third attractor. And with this sort of wider context of this increasing unraveling and the kind of off the scale normalization of state violence that we're seeing in Palestine and in the States and in other areas, other regions, we know that we've really got to have really robust processes, and that we've got to help people come to us because we are actually providing a compelling alternative. We know that's one reason why why fascist and far right messaging is landing, because it's providing something really compelling that the left somehow isn't able to do in such a compelling way. People that are in our group have talked about the low cognitive load of far right messaging, and how it kind of makes things very simple to step into. And perhaps in the left, we kind of retain some of the complexity of our world, and therefore it's actually harder to see what it might be offering. So this third attractor piece feels really significant, and we're just beginning to kind of get into how that might be a theory of change, which would be mirrored at the neighbourhood design level, and it would be fractal. So the idea that what might happen in a neighbourhood, in a street, in an exchange with somebody knocking on someone's door to say, you know, do you fancy having a chat about this stuff? We could get together. We need to get to know our neighbours and help each other as things get harder. That we are working towards this same goal of attracting people into something more powerful, more effective, more beautiful, more equitable, more just, with, you know, putting all sentient beings and all people at the heart of it.
So I'm just wondering, with the time, to pause briefly now. I know we have more to share and next steps, so we should just pause and sort of note a couple of the comments and see if there are any questions, and then come back and finish. Or do you rather keep going?
No, and I can't see the time actually with the screen share on. So
I just want to make sure that there is a little bit of time, and then we can come back.
Let me just I think, because this is the last slide, so essentially what we're doing is working up this neighbourhood design, and we're going to continue feeding that into our work in Stroud, including looking at the standing assembly and the implementation network. And where it kind of in a way comes full circle is that they're coming back into the neighbourhood level with all the beautiful projects for community compost and tree planting and allotments and whatever. It feels as though we can come back to all of that, resting into the fact there is a bigger plan for this this democratic revolution, subject to capacity and funding, but that there is a place for all of that if we can federate and scale and build our power, and have these deliberative processes alongside it or informing it. So yeah, I will pause there. And
thank you, Jo.
thank you for sharing.